While you and I were getting our festive cheer on, singing Christmas carols, planning parties, pulling out our best threads to ring in the new year, India's gig workers were left out in the cold, quite literally. Delivery riders cutting through foggy streets, late night drops, peak hour pressure. And beneath all that cheer, something was brewing.
मेरा नाम शेख सलाउद्दीन है। मैं फाउंडर स्टेट प्रेसिडेंट तेलंगाना गिग एंड प्लेटफॉर्म वर्कर्स यूनियन और को फाउंडर नेशनल जनरल सेक्रेटरी इंडियन फेडरेशन ऑफ ऐप बेस्ड ट्रांसपोर्ट वर्कर्स। आप देखे होंगे 25 और 31 के दिन हम लोग ने फ्लैश स्ट्राइक का आगाज दिया था। 25 के दिन जो फ्लैश स्ट्राइक था उसके अंदर 40,000 मेंबर्स पार्ट लिए और 60% तक ऑर्डर डिले हुआ। और ऐसी 31 को भी इसके अंदर 2,10,000 जने पार्टिसिपेट करे और 60% वहाँ पे भी ऑर्डर्स डिले देखने के लिए मिला। ये तो सिर्फ एक ट्रेलर था, पिक्चर अभी बाकी है। हम लोग ने प्लेटफॉर्म कंपनीज को अभी भी अपॉर्चुनिटी दे रहे कि बैठ के बातचीत कर सकते।
Over Christmas and New Year's, sections of gig workers chose this exact moment to protest. They flagged shrinking take-home pay, punishing delivery timelines, arbitrary app-based penalties, and the absence of basics such as social security, grievance redressal, or even clarity on when and why their accounts can be switched off, just like that. For platforms, this was uncomfortable timing. The response was swift. Higher per-day payouts, surge incentives, bonuses, promises of better earnings for those willing to log in during peak hours. The message was clear. Stay online, keep deliveries moving, and the money will flow. Then came the counter narrative, a full-throttled PR campaign in defense of the gig model. Platform founders sidestepped talks of exploitation, calling it an opportunity instead. That gig work creates jobs at scale, that flexibility matters, that earnings have improved, and that over-regulation could end up hurting the very workers it claims to protect. All this is unfolding at a critical moment because India's gig economy is on the verge of exploding. A Niti Aayog report estimates that the number of gig and platform workers will rise from about 7.7 million in 2021 to over 23 million by the end of this decade. That's nearly 1 in 20 livelihoods in the country. So today, we ask some uncomfortable questions. Will the new labor codes actually change life on the ground for gig workers or simply put a legal stamp on how platforms already operate? Will these reforms close loopholes or legitimize them? It's Thursday, the 8th of January. I'm Neil Ghai, and you're listening to The Morning Brief. We begin with Kartik Narayan, CEO of the jobs marketplace at apna.co. Listen in to what he had to say. Hi, Kartik. Welcome to the Morning Brief.
Yeah, hi, Neil. Thanks for having me.
Kartik, let's get down to it. What side of the gig work debate do you identify with more closely? The view that gig work offers choice and flexibility, as argued by some platform founders, or the view that it systematically exploits workers? Or is there a middle path, and why?
I think it's too reductive for a country of a large size, right? So the pro-flexibility view would be saying, listen, student or graduates or whoever that might be, they need flexible working and hence, this is a great model. Obviously, the exploitation view is gig work ends up becoming a person's sole source of income. And hence, if he's working 10 to 14 hours a day, then that becomes some sort of a lack of flexibility. And hence, he's exploited by the employer. I think the answer really lies somewhere in the middle. So I would rather say it's more of a empowered flexibility the idea should be, in my view, not binary, but the fact that we need to figure out not to kill the gig model, but look at saying, how can we make this more formal in some sense, so that, the workers get the kind of work that they want to do with the flexibility. And on the other side, they're not exploited in the sense the way it's being framed right.
Kartik, why do you think the sharp divide exists between voices like Goyal Bikhchandani, who defend the gig model, and those who argue that gig workers are underpaid, overworked, and underprotected?
I think even before we get into, individual points of view, every year there are about 10 to 15 million graduates who are passing out of the country. Nearly about 55% of them do not have the skills to be employed, right, at the age of 22, 23. And by the time they become 30, of course, this number reduces. But, people who are defending the model typically look at the fact that there are millions of unemployable youth. This is an opportunity for them to get their first paycheck. There is massive labor surplus, and traditional 9 to 5 jobs are not in a position to be able to absorb this. I think that folks who are critiquing the model obviously are focusing more on individual dignity. They see a lack of career ladders. Obviously, algorithmic platforms, in some sense, they believe are trying to scheme and transfer all this risk, right? Fuel, accidents, health onto the individual. So I think that these are the two sides of the debate, where one is clearly saying, let me provide some sort of an employment to individuals who are clearly not going to get employed. The other side is saying they're still seeing it from an individual dignity, 9 to 5 kind of a job, saying what's the next step for them. So that's really the divide coming from.
So who is driving the push for greater protections today? Is it the workers themselves, unions, courts, or policymakers? And how seriously are employers taking these demands?
Obviously, there has been a rapid increase, right, since 2021 to now. For a country of 140 crore, 150 crore population, the absolute number of formal workers as seen by EPFO or by the number of people who file income tax, not pay income tax, is between 7 to 8 crores. What we have seen now rapidly is gig work is nearly reaching 1 crore this year. And even as per Niti Aayog, it's going to reach 2 to 3 crores. So this is a workforce which is expanding. So earlier, perhaps, was not so much of a point of view on what is required to intervene or regulate in this space. So it's a confluence of, I would say, courts taking a rights-based approach. I would say policymakers have now gotten, realizing that an unprotected workforce is going to be a long-term state liability in some sense. But I would also going to make an argument that employers are also taking this very seriously now. Not just regulation, but because regulation is the number one problem in India right now. And it's not just related to gig workforce. A disgruntled workforce is going to be a very expensive workforce, and the churn is going to hit both productivity as well as, I would say, service experience to their end customers. So it is not just one stakeholder. I think multiple stakeholders come along.
Kartik, when clients hire gig workers through job platforms like yours, where do they draw the line between business efficiency and responsibility towards worker welfare?
I think business efficiency is, to be honest with you, is more really regarding predictability. In our platform, for the Diwali season, roughly about 2 lakh odd jobs got posted, right? 70% of them are essentially gig work. What do employers really want to do? They want to scale up for a 10-day festive scale and scale down immediately after. It's true with respect to New Year shipments as well, right? So clients are now realizing that if a worker is underprotected, the service quality drops, high churn, low motivation, so on and so forth. So what we are seeing is there is a definite shift which is taking place towards worker welfare. That is going to become some sort of a standardized line item. And if I have to kind of draw a correlation, it's pretty much like the way sustainability entered the supply chain nearly a decade.
How is that relevant?
It is relevant because earlier the worker welfare was not a line item which was being looked upon by most platform workers. It was largely pay for the piece delivered or pay for the activity done. Now, I think increasingly what initially started with some amount of, let's say, insurance for accidents or healthcare coverage, etc., and all that, are now going to become standardized. Partially, of course, the platforms are doing it themselves. Now, of course, the government is also coming down in terms of exactly what kind of a social security cover can be provided to them. So it is going to be definitely gig work as the model as it retains, but more importantly, with some sort of a protection for gig workers, even within that particular space.
Where do you see genuine merit in gig workers' demands for social security, minimum pay, or predictability? And Kartik, where do you think expectations may be misaligned with market realities?
See, right now, the entire debate had got charged only with respect to what we call picker, packer, loader, and delivery folks, right? That is 35-40% of the gig worker. We should not forget there are others in logistics. And then there are people who come to households and provide different kinds of services. So it encompasses the entire thing. But given that, topic has a certain inclination right now, I would say definitely some sort of an accident insurance, especially on the delivery side of it, is non-negotiable at all. I think some comprehension of an equivalent of a minimum hourly earnings is also, I think, equally important. I think the misaligned expectation and the entire topic of debate right now is really to expect some sort of a full-time predictability in terms of, I think some of the topical points which are being put forward is, can we have a guaranteed 40-hour work week every week? I think in a gig model, that's a mismatch. I think the very nature of gig work is to handle fluctuating demand. So if we are going to force rigid predictability, then I'll take you back to my original point. If 10 million graduates are passing out and we remove this low barrier entry point that allows millions to at least join the gig workforce and make some money, that percentage will come down significantly, right? To perhaps maybe 10 those people.
How do you expect the new labor code to change gig hiring decisions? Will it formalize the sector, raise costs and reduce demand, or push companies to rethink how they structure gig roles altogether?
I think the new labor code is not with respect to gig worker. I think there's a lot more to. I think the number one problem in India which they are trying to solve is increasing formal workforce in itself. Obviously, with respect to gig workforce, and some states have done it, but the more important part the central government is coming out with is the formalization via social security fund, right? Now, 1 to 2% of your turnover, I think it's capped at about 5% of what you paid your workers. 1 to 2% of your turnover to welfare fund, the government is mandating. So I think that is going to create a pool of money which can be utilized for the gig work. So I think that's the number one aspect. I think there'll be subsequent points which will hit most of these platform aggregators or employers of gig workers. One is obviously it's going to standardize costs. It levels the play. Second thing is companies will now start moving towards consciously hybrid models, right? So they will keep a core layer, fixed term employees for high predictable skills, etc. and all that. And then, of course, use gig tier for true work. I think because the government is formalizing this model, I think a society will move forward with respect to how they are viewing gig workforce with a degree of social safety net and kind of make the model more stable.
So that's interesting. So will these additional costs, the 1 to 2% of turnover that must be put into the welfare fund, be passed on to the end customers? How else will they fund it?
Even employers are really looking at saying, attrition amongst gig workforce on a monthly basis is nearly 40%, right? That is unsustainable. So for them as well, if they have a model where the worker also feels saying, listen, I'm able to make money, but I'm also being taken care of in some sense, the attrition will kind of come down. I think there is definitely a cost of hiring, training, and deploying all these individuals. I think the productivity which comes out of a small dip in attrition itself will pay back for the cost of 1 to 2%, which is going to be absorbed by, I would assume, by the company. Some portion of it's inevitable, which will pass on to the customers as well. But I think the benefits of having a social security cover for this particular layer would hugely go beyond the cost which is going to be incurred both by the customers and the employers.
Next, we turn to the law. We spoke with Anshul Prakash, partner for employment, labor and benefits at Khaitan Co, about the legal grey zones platforms operate in. Listen in. Hi Anshul, welcome to the Morning Brief.
Hi Neil.
Just to begin with, can you tell our listeners what are the key grey areas or loopholes in India's current labor laws that e-commerce, quick commerce platforms and aggregators are able to legally exploit when engaging gig workers?
So Neil, the biggest gray area is that for a long time, Indian labor laws simply did not know what to do with the work that is not traditional employment, but also not genuinely independent. And that is what gig workers are all about. And they sat in a no man's land until the Social Security Code and a few state laws on gig worker welfare schemes came into force. They were completely outside the protection of labor laws altogether. Even now, the Code of Social Security acknowledges gig and platform workers, but it does that in a very limited way. So I'll just quickly explain. It offers the possibility of welfare schemes, but it also deliberately stops short of giving them the core protections that employees would otherwise get. So things like minimum wages, paid leave, job security, protection against sudden termination or retrenchment, or long-term benefits, tenure-based benefits like gratuity. So what platforms are really doing is not exploiting loopholes in the classic sense of the term. They are operating in spaces where the law is still vague or incomplete. And the code of social security creates a very limited safety net. But it does not change the basic nature of this relationship. And how meaningful the protection becomes will completely depend almost entirely on how the central and state governments design and implement the schemes going forward, which as of now are yet to be seen. There is much to be talked about, but we haven't seen those social security schemes being really brought into force.
Anshul, why has the classification of gig workers as independent contractors rather than employees become the central fault line in this debate? And how defensible is this position in law?
A great question. Classification sits at the heart of this debate, Neil, because in India, almost every meaningful labor protection flows from being an employee. Now, gig workers are not classified as employees, so they fall outside the scope of labor laws. Apart from limited welfare benefits under the Social Security Code and a few state laws, for example, Karnataka has brought in its own law pertaining to gig workers' social security. The gig workers largely have to rely on whatever contractual protections they have and whatever the platform chooses to offer. So on paper, gig workers are treated much like independent contractors, but in reality, the relationship often looks very different from a true principal to principal arrangement. So it is not a business to business, principal to principal arrangement in true sense of the term. If I quickly take an example of an independent contractor, they usually have a genuine autonomy, control over how they work. There is no real exclusivity. So they can work for any other player in the market. They can render services. Now, gig and platform workers, by contrast, are often governed by algorithms through performance ratings, incentives, penalties, and even sudden deactivations. So you end up with a situation where the control starts to resemble an employment relationship. It looks like an employer-employee relationship, but without the corresponding rights and protections which an employee has. Now, that tension is why classification has become the fault line. Now, legally, the platform position is not wrong. If you ask me, the platforms, what they're doing, nothing is illegal about it because the law has not yet fully adapted itself to algorithm-driven work.
So, Anshul, this question might sound moot to you because from the sentiment that I've gauged from our conversation thus far, I think it's fairly obvious, but I must ask you this anyways. Who benefits the most from the present regulatory ambiguity? Is it the platforms? Is it staffing intermediaries, job platforms, or the workers? And who bears the greatest risk?
I mean, kind of the response is obvious, Neil. Right now, the clear beneficiaries of this regulatory ambiguity are the platforms and staffing intermediaries as well. Because, as I mentioned, lack of protective regime under a specific statute for gig workers gives the platforms and staffing intermediaries greater flexibility, cost efficiency, and the ability to scale quickly without taking on the compliance burden that comes with traditional workforce. See how this whole premise evolved is because you do not want to take up the entire burden of how a regular employee workforce is going to be or bring it for you. So, I mean, if you ask about the downside risk, again, it's the gig workers or the platform workers who, on the other hand, carry most of the downside risk because their incomes can fluctuate. There is no real job security, and disengagement can happen overnight with very limited legal recourse. So they cannot immediately approach the competent adjudication authority to claim anything as a matter of right when it comes to matters of cessation. That is still contractually driven. So unlike what a regular employee, especially in the worker category, would get in front of, let's say, the adjudicating forum, which is labor commissioner, and followed by that, the labor courts. It is different for the gig workers.
Sure. Anshul, I'm going to take you back to your first response, which sort of touched upon the loopholes that e-commerce, quick commerce platforms are able to exploit. So where does the proposed labor code attempt to close these loopholes? And where does it still leave room for platforms to operate much as they do today?
So, Neil, I think valid question, but I can say the biggest change under Social Security Code is recognition. Now, this is for the first time gig and platform workers are formally recognized and acknowledged in a central labor statute. That in itself is an achievement. Now,
Correct.
It states very clearly aggregators are required to contribute to certain social security fund, which will be formulated by the appropriate government. Now, this addresses the earlier situation where this entire segment of workforce existed in a regulatory vacuum. There was nothing. They were just there. I mean, we all saw this section of workforce being there on the roads, riding very quickly, delivering things or rendering services from, I think A to Z. But what we really saw is there was no formal recognition. At least we are moving in that direction. Code on Social Security recognizes that. But again, I would like to mention that Social Security Code is also very carefully designed not to go too far. And this is touching upon the previous point which I was trying to make. It does not mandate minimum wages. It does not talk about paid leave entitlements. It does not really talk about protection against arbitrary termination. It also avoids settling difficult questions around control and supervision. Instead of that, most of the protection is left to future welfare schemes, which will be notified by the central and state government. So, in practical terms, platforms still have a lot of room to operate much as they do today. The main shift is the introduction of a financial and compliance obligation, not a fundamental change in how gig workers are engaged or classified. There is also a real possibility that the added compliance costs will be pushed back onto the system. Let's say through lower incentives, fewer work opportunities, or even tighter engagement models. We don't know. So this really has to be seen as a starting point, Neil, not a solution. It recognizes the problem, but whether it really bridges the gap between theory and reality will completely depend on how carefully future regulation would balance protection with flexibility that made gig work viable in the first place.
What's clear is this: the future of gig work in India won't be decided by protest alone, or by corporate messaging, or even by what's written in the labor codes. It will be decided by how those laws are enforced and by whom. Because labor is a subject on the concurrent list. Both the center and states can legislate laws on it, but it's the states where laws are implemented. And that means the experience of a gig worker in one state could look very different from that of a worker in another. In the end, whether the new labor codes protect gig workers or merely formalize today's realities will depend on political will, on how sympathetic state governments are to worker demands, and on whether flexibility continues to trump security in India's growth story. For millions of workers powering the convenience economy, the stakes couldn't be higher. That's it for today. This episode was produced by Vinay Joshi, sound designed by Indraneel Bhattacharya, with executive producers Arijit Burman and Anirban Chaudhary. If you like this episode, do spread the word. You can find The Morning Brief on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, this is Neil Ghai signing off.